Billionaire's twins failed. Every test, until a black janitor taught them one secret. The crystal chandelier in the Richardson mansion cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table where 2 report cards lay like death sentences. Every grade was a glaring red F, each one a testament to failure that would make headlines if the media ever got wind of it. Jonathan Richardson, CEO of Richardson Global Industries and one of the wealthiest men in America, stared at the papers with a mixture of rage and desperation that money couldn't fix. His 16-year-old twin sons, Alexander and Benjamin, sat across from him in designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, yet their faces bore the hollow emptiness of children who had everything except what they needed most. This wasn't just about failing grades, this was about 2 brilliant minds that had been systematically destroyed by a life of privilege, and a father who was about to discover that the answer to his family's crisis would come from the most unexpected source. But here's what Jonathan didn't know yet, and what would change everything. The woman he had hired as a night janitor 3 months ago wasn't just any ordinary cleaner. Keisha Williams held a PhD in educational psychology from Harvard, had published groundbreaking research on learning disabilities, and had spent 15 years transforming the lives of struggling students before a family tragedy forced her to take any job she could find to survive. The Richardson family was about to learn that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unlikely places. Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop a comment and let me know your city or country. And if this story touches your heart, please hit that subscribe button because we share real stories that matter. Stories that remind us that every person we meet is fighting battles we know nothing about. Jonathan's voice boomed through the dining room like thunder. Explain this to me. Private tutors costing $50,000 a semester, the most exclusive prep schools in the country, every advantage money can buy, and this is what I get. How is this even possible? His fist slammed against the table, making the crystal glasses jump. Alexander, the older twin by 12 minutes, slumped deeper into his chair, his eyes fixed on his hands. At 16 he was tall and athletic like his father, with the same dark hair and strong jawline, but where his father possessed commanding confidence, Alexander carried only shame. I don't know, Dad. I study for hours, but when I sit down for the test, it's like everything just disappears. It's like there's this fog in my brain that I can't clear. Benjamin, smaller and quieter than his brother, spoke without looking up from the geometric patterns he was unconsciously drawing on his napkin. The tutors say we're not applying ourselves, that we're lazy because we have everything handed to us. His voice was barely above a whisper, but each word carried the weight of years of accumulated failure. Jonathan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. As a man who had built a business empire from nothing, who had never accepted failure in any form, watching his sons surrender to defeat was more painful than any business loss he had ever endured. Lazy? You're Richardson's. I didn't build this company by accepting excuses. Failure is not in our DNA. Maybe it is now, Alexander said quietly, and something in his tone made Jonathan stop pacing. Maybe we're just not cut out for this. Maybe we're the end of the Richardson success story. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. These weren't the confident, capable sons he had dreamed of raising, the boys who would one day take over his empire and carry the family name forward. These were strangers living in his house, brilliant minds trapped behind walls of self-doubt and resignation that he didn't know how to tear down. That's enough, Jonathan said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier thunder. I've arranged for new specialists. Dr. Hoffman's team from Switzerland, they work with European royalty. They'll be here Monday morning. This ends now. Benjamin finally looked up, and for a moment Jonathan saw not defiance, but deep pain in his son's eyes. More strangers who'll spend 3 weeks trying to figure out what's wrong with us, then leave when they realize we're hopeless cases. You're not hopeless, Jonathan said, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Alexander stood up slowly, his movements carrying a weariness that no 16-year-old should possess. We've heard that before, Dad. From 12 different tutors, 5 educational specialists, and 3 child psychologists. They all start out saying we're smart, that we just need the right approach. Then they leave, and we're still here, still failing everything, still disappointing you. 3 floors below, in the mansion's basement level, Keisha Williams pushed her cart through the marble corridors, her rubber-soled shoes silent against the polished floors. At 42, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. But her eyes missed nothing. She had heard every word of the argument upstairs, and her heart ached for those boys in a way that surprised her. Keisha knew about failure. She knew about brilliant minds that couldn't fit into traditional molds. Her own son David had struggled with severe dyslexia and ADHD until she had discovered the teaching methods that would eventually make her famous in academic circles. David had gone on to become a gifted artist and engineer, seeing the world in ways that traditional education never could have nurtured. But David was gone now, taken by a drunk driver 2 years ago, along with her husband James. The grief had shattered her world so completely that she had lost her position at the university, lost her research funding, and eventually lost everything except the knowledge that still lived in her mind and the desperate need to honor her son's memory by helping other struggling children. Now she cleaned the offices and hallways of the very people she once consulted with, invisible to them, but acutely aware of their struggles. And what she was seeing in the Richardson family was a tragedy that money couldn't solve, but understanding and patience might. As she cleaned the library where Alexander often sat, staring at unopened textbooks, Keisha noticed something that all those expensive tutors had missed. The boy wasn't lazy or defiant. His notes were covered with intricate drawings, geometric patterns, and architectural designs that showed a mind that thought in 3-dimensional images, not linear text. When she found Benjamin's abandoned homework in the music room, she saw the same thing. Mathematical equations reworked as musical notation, chemistry formulas arranged in rhythmic patterns that followed musical scales. These weren't failing students. These were profoundly gifted children, whose minds worked in ways that traditional education not only didn't accommodate, but actively discouraged. They were visual and kinesthetic learners trapped in an auditory sequential educational system, like asking virtuoso pianists to prove their musical ability by playing violins. The next evening, as Keisha cleaned the main hallway, she encountered Alexander sitting on the grand staircase at midnight, a physics textbook in his lap and tears of frustration streaming down his cheeks. Beside him sat Benjamin, trying to comfort his brother while struggling with his own calculus homework, pages covered with eraser marks and abandoned attempts. For a moment, they all looked at each other, 3 people existing in the same space, but living in completely different worlds. The boys had never really noticed the cleaning lady before. She was part of the invisible army of staff that kept their world running smoothly. But tonight, something in her eyes made them pause. "Trouble sleeping?" Keisha asked gently, breaking the unspoken rule that separated staff from family. Alexander wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed to be caught crying. "Just trying to understand quantum mechanics. Have another test tomorrow. I'll fail it like all the others." Benjamin held up his calculus book. "And I'm supposed to master derivatives by morning. Might as well try to fly to the moon." Keisha set down her supplies, and against every protocol she had been given, sat beside them on the marble steps. The boys looked surprised, but didn't move away. In their isolated world of failed expectations and disappointed adults, perhaps any human connection felt better than none. "May I see?" Keisha asked, gesturing to their textbooks. The brothers hesitated, then handed her their books. Keisha looked at the pages, dense with mathematical formulas and abstract concepts, then at their notes, covered in those beautiful geometric drawings and musical notations. "You know," she said quietly, "Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. He saw the universe in pictures and patterns before he ever saw it in equations. Tesla could build entire machines in his mind, testing and perfecting them before he ever touched a tool." "Yeah, well, Our teachers don't grade imagination, Alexander said bitterly. And they definitely don't accept musical notation as valid mathematical proof, Benjamin added with a hollow laugh. Keisha smiled, seeing in these boys the same frustrated brilliance she had recognized in her own son years earlier. What if I told you that your brains might be wired like those genius inventors, that those drawings and patterns you create aren't distractions from learning, they might be the key to it? For the first time in months, both boys looked directly at another adult with something other than defeat in their eyes. What do you mean? Alexander asked. Your minds think in images, patterns, and spatial relationships. Benjamin, you understand mathematical concepts through rhythm and musical structure. You're both trying to force your brains to learn like everyone else's mind, but what if we worked with how you actually think, instead of against it? Benjamin leaned forward, his voice carrying a hope he was afraid to acknowledge. You really think our brains aren't broken? There's nothing broken about either of you, Keisha said firmly. You're just trying to learn in a language that isn't yours. But I know your language. I've spent my career learning to speak it. Over the next hour, sitting on those cold marble steps, while the mansion slept around them, Keisha did something no tutor had ever done. She listened, really listened. She heard Alexander describe how he could visualize complex physics concepts as three-dimensional structures that he could manipulate and explore in his mind, but couldn't translate them into the mathematical language his teachers demanded. She heard Benjamin explain how mathematical relationships felt like musical harmonies to him, with patterns and progressions that made perfect sense until he had to express them in traditional numerical formats. Tomorrow, Keisha said finally, if you're willing, meet me in the library after your father goes to bed. Bring your physics and calculus homework. We're going to try something completely different. What kind of different? Alexander asked, skepticism warring with desperate hope in his voice. We're going to let your minds work the way they were designed to work. We're going to turn physics into architecture and mathematics into music. We're going to prove to you that you're not broken. The system is. The next night and every night after, the library became a secret classroom. Keisha introduced Alexander to the visual learning techniques she had developed during her years of research, showing him how to convert abstract equations into geometric forms he could build and manipulate in his mind like architectural models. She taught Benjamin to structure mathematical problems like musical compositions, with themes and variations that his brain could follow naturally. But more than teaching techniques, Keisha gave them something they had never had, an adult who believed completely in their intelligence. She shared stories of famous inventors and artists whose minds worked like theirs, who had struggled in traditional schools but changed the world once they found their own ways of thinking and learning. Leonardo da Vinci was probably dyslexic, she told them one night as they worked through calculus problems that Benjamin was finally beginning to understand. Einstein didn't speak until he was 4 and was considered slow by his teachers. Your brains aren't defective, they're just running different operating systems. Once you learn to work with your system instead of against it, there's no limit to what you can accomplish. The transformation was gradual, but undeniable. Alexander's grades began to improve dramatically as he learned to visualize mathematical and scientific concepts as three-dimensional models before translating them to paper. Benjamin's test scores soared when he started approaching problems through musical and rhythmic patterns. More importantly, the hollow emptiness in their eyes was replaced by something that had been missing for years: genuine confidence and joy in learning. They began staying up later not because they were struggling with homework, but because they were excited about the problems they were solving. Alexander started designing architectural models to illustrate physics principles. Benjamin composed musical pieces that demonstrated mathematical relationships. For the first time in their lives, learning felt like discovery rather than defeat. But their secret meetings couldn't last forever. 3 weeks after their first encounter on the stairs, Jonathan discovered them in the library at 2 in the morning. He stood in the doorway, still in his business suit from a late board meeting, watching his sons explain calculus concepts to each other using methods that looked more like art than mathematics, while a woman in a janitor's uniform guided them with the expertise and passion of a master teacher. "What the hell is going on here?" Jonathan's voice cut through the peaceful atmosphere like a blade. The boys jumped, and Keisha stood calmly, no longer the invisible servant but the educator she had always been. "Your sons are learning, Mr. Richardson. They're discovering that they're not failures." Jonathan's fury was immediate and absolute. "You're the night janitor. You have absolutely no right to interfere with my children's education. You're fired. Security will escort you out immediately." "Dad, no!" Alexander jumped up, panic replacing the confidence that had been growing in his voice over the past weeks. "She's helping us. For the first time in my life, I actually understand my homework. I solved a quantum mechanics problem tonight that I couldn't even read 3 weeks ago." "Please, Dad," Benjamin added, tears streaming down his face. "She doesn't make us feel stupid. She makes us feel like we might actually be smart after all." But Jonathan was already on his phone, calling security, his worldview threatened by the possibility that a janitor had succeeded where Harvard-trained specialists had failed. "Get her out of my house now, and boys, you're confined to your rooms until I figure out what kind of inappropriate influence this woman has had on you." As security approached to escort Keisha toward the door, Alexander made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He stepped between the guards and Keisha, his voice steady and strong in a way Jonathan had never heard before. "If she goes, I go too." Jonathan stopped mid-dial on his phone. "What did you say?" "I said if you throw away the only person who's ever believed in me, then you obviously don't want me here either." His voice was calm now, filled with a self-respect that Keisha's teaching had given him. "Benjamin and I aren't broken, Dad. We never were. We just needed someone who could see us for who we actually are, instead of constantly trying to fix what was never broken." Benjamin moved to stand beside his brother, no longer the quiet, defeated boy who had sat at the dinner table hours earlier. "She taught us more in 3 weeks than we learned in 3 years of expensive tutors. And not just about school, she taught us that being different doesn't mean being defective." Jonathan looked at his sons, really looked at them, for the first time in years. They stood together with a dignity and confidence he hadn't seen since they were small children, before the failures started accumulating and the tutors started arriving. These weren't the defeated, hollow-eyed teenagers who had sat across from him at dinner just 3 weeks ago. They stood with their shoulders back, their eyes clear, with the kind of inner strength that no amount of money could buy, but that he had been unknowingly destroying for years. "Who are you?" Jonathan asked Keisha, his voice softer now, confusion replacing anger. "Dr. Keisha Williams," Keisha replied quietly. "I have a PhD in educational psychology from Harvard. I spent 15 years developing learning methodologies for students whose minds work differently. I've published extensively on visual, spatial, and musical mathematical learning styles. Your sons aren't learning disabled, Mr. Richardson. They're profoundly gifted students who think in ways that traditional education doesn't just fail to accommodate, it actively punishes." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He felt his legs go weak and sank into one of the library's leather chairs. "You have a PhD from Harvard? Then why in God's name are you working as a janitor in my house?" For the first time since he had known her, Keisha's professional composure cracked slightly, and Jonathan saw the deep pain that lived behind her calm exterior. "Because 2 years ago, I lost my son and my husband in a car accident. David was killed by a drunk driver, and James died trying to save him. The grief destroyed my ability to function in my old life. I lost my position at the university, lost my research funding, lost everything that mattered to me. I took this job because I needed to survive, but also because I needed to feel useful again, even if no one knew who I really was." The library fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock. Jonathan felt the world shifting beneath his feet as he realized that he had hired one of the country's leading experts on learning differences to clean his floors. while paying incompetent tutors hundreds of thousands of dollars to systematically destroy his son's self-esteem. Your sons, Keisha continued, her voice growing stronger, are visual, spatial, and musical mathematical learners with exceptionally high intelligence. Alexander's mind processes information in three-dimensional spatial patterns. Benjamin's brain organizes information in musical and rhythmic structures. They've been trying to succeed in an auditory sequential learning environment for their entire academic careers, which is like asking master violinists to prove their musical ability by playing piano. It's not that they can't make music, they just need the right instruments. Jonathan looked at his sons standing beside this woman who had seen their potential when he had only seen their failures. I've been making them feel worthless. I've been so focused on fixing them that I never considered that they might not be broken. It's not too late, Keisha said gently. They're brilliant young men who just needed someone to believe in them. But more than that, they needed their father to see them for who they really are, not who he thinks they should be. Over the following months, everything changed in ways that Jonathan had never imagined possible. He didn't just rehire Keisha, he made her the boys' private educational consultant, funded her to restart her research, and eventually established a foundation in her son's name to support alternative learning methodologies. Alexander and Benjamin's grades didn't just improve, they soared beyond anything their expensive tutors had ever achieved. But more importantly, they rediscovered their relationship with their father, who learned to see their differences as extraordinary gifts rather than shameful defects. Alexander went on to study architectural engineering at MIT, using his visual spatial abilities to design buildings that seemed to defy the laws of physics. His senior project, a disaster-resistant housing complex that could be assembled like three-dimensional puzzles, won national recognition and is now being implemented in earthquake-prone regions around the world. Benjamin became a composer and mathematician, creating musical algorithms that solved complex computational problems and composing symphonies that mathematically modeled everything from weather patterns to stock market fluctuations. His work bridged the gap between art and science in ways that revolutionized both fields, but the real transformation was in Jonathan himself. He learned that true success couldn't be measured in quarterly reports or stock prices, but in the moment when someone you love believes in themselves for the first time. The Richardson Foundation for Alternative Learning now funds research and programs for students whose minds work differently, ensuring that brilliant children like Alexander and Benjamin never have to suffer through years of feeling broken when they're actually extraordinary. Keisha found her way back to herself through teaching the Richardson boys, discovering that healing doesn't come from forgetting our losses, but from using our pain to help others find their way. She eventually returned to university teaching, but she never forgot the lesson she learned in that mansion, that sometimes the people who need our help the most are hidden behind walls of privilege and expectation. And sometimes the people who can help us most are hiding behind uniforms that make them invisible to those who need them. The story of the Richardson family reminds us that intelligence comes in countless forms, that love sometimes requires us to completely abandon our expectations and see the people we care about with fresh eyes. It shows us that real education isn't about forcing minds to conform to arbitrary standards, but about discovering how each unique mind can flourish and contribute to the world. Years later, when asked about the secret that changed everything, Keisha would smile and say, "There was no secret. There was just the willingness to see these boys as they really were, brilliant, capable, and worthy of belief." Sometimes the most profound transformations happen when we stop trying to fix people and start trying to understand them. Every mind is a universe waiting to be explored, but only if we're humble enough to learn its language. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that every person has value and every mind has genius waiting to be discovered, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember to subscribe, because we're here to share the stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the extraordinary power of believing in each other, especially when that belief comes from the most unexpected places.